Hey everyone, welcome back to RetroBreak. Today we're taking a look at 3 cancelled Game Boy Advance games that actually got full physical releases. It's taken me a long time to track these down, but I finally have them, and all 3 of these have really interesting stories to go along with them as well. I can't wait to get into it in this week's episode. Let's get started. So let's begin with the most recent release here. This one is Elland: The Crystal Wars, and this was actually a cancelled Dune game from way back in around 2002 or 3, and I was really curious as to how this game actually managed to get a re-release by the Retro Room, so I invited him onto my podcast and asked him all about it. So without further ado, here is John Rue to tell you everything you need to know about this release right here. Tell me a bit about Elland and how that came about.
Yeah, so it was originally a Dune game that was never released. It got canceled because I believe the company went bankrupt. I don't know, don't quote me on that, but I think the company went bankrupt and all of the property goes into auction, I guess, and some other company buys it up.
Yeah.
And in this case, they bought it up, and I'm pretty sure the project was just shelved. It was just like, oh, let's just put this in a box in the basement kind of thing. And it sat for 20 years, just unused.
Was it finished? Was the game completed? Or did you have to patch anything?
It was close.
Right.
Yeah, we had to kind of tie up some loose ends. But it was so close that it was disappointing, you know. These developers worked really hard on this project just for it to get like not seen by anybody and just shelved and not get a proper release. Yeah, that was the unfortunate fate of this game, even though those developers get paid a salary or whatever. And you know, I was offered the game, and I think it's because I was willing to do the work on it. It wasn't like going to be this project that you're gonna make all this freaking money. It's like, no, you got to put money into the project, you know. And in that case, we had to remove so much stuff from
How much work was that then, scouring every little bit of the game to make sure it had all been taken out?
There's a tester that I work with. His name's Ryan, and he's really, really awesome. And we already were ripping stuff out of it. I thought it was super cool. I had no real experience with Dune, so I was like, dude, rip it out.
Yeah.
Like, I'll take it. Let's rip out the Dune stuff and release this game because it's cool on its own. It holds up on its own. Sure, like, you know, you might, you know, make, if I were to, you know, some big company came along and got the Dune license and actually released it, maybe they'd make more money or whatever. But no, I didn't care about that. You know, I liked the game. I wanted to see it get a release. You know, after I released it, actually, like, some of the developers had hit me up and were like, yo, that's super cool that we get to see it happen. Like, I saw
fantastic.
this on, you know, they were like, I saw an article on IGN talking about how this game I worked on 20 years ago is getting released. And I'm like, dude, you know, that's really cool, you know. We had to scour with like a fine-tooth comb to try to pull out, and over and over and over again, and have several people looking at this script to try to pull everything in. You know, at one point I printed like 1,000 manuals for the game, the actual physical manuals, and the intellectual property owner like saw that there was some copywritten material in those manuals.
Oh, no.
So I had to just so I had to scrap them, get it redesigned, reprinted, and you know, so it just went through this like intricate process of just vetting it and trying to get it to this point to where we're not going to get in trouble from anybody to release it, you know. So yeah, it was an expensive and like a hard endeavor for sure.
Yeah, worthwhile though, and like you said, it's just such an impressive game as well. If it had have come out back then, I think people would have been all over it.
Yeah, it's really cool. You don't see very many like first-person shooters for the GBA, and the ones that you do are really impressive. There's like X vs. Ever, that's a really cool one, and a couple of others.
The thing that was unique about this one, you can press the L and R buttons to like go higher and lower as well, which is, I've not really played anything like that on the GBA before, so that was really cool. Yeah,
it kind of has this like feeling of like Descent or something like that, and it's a cool game. Yeah, like I said, I really, as soon as I played it, I was like, oh yeah, I want to get my hands on this and release it because of that. It was just a really fun game.
So it's unfortunate that it never got a release, but it is fantastic that John Rue managed to get hold of the IP, tweak it enough to actually give it a full physical release, and you can actually still buy it right now over on his website. So of course, I'll put a link to that down in the description below. Definitely go and check it out if you want something really, really impressive for the Game Boy Advance with a really interesting history behind it too. And if you did enjoy these clips here from John and you want to listen to the full podcast as soon as it's released, check the links in the description and in the pinned comments to go and check out my podcast channel and go and follow it over on Spotify or Apple Podcasts as well. I would really appreciate that. I've been putting a lot of effort into the podcast episodes recently, so I really hope you enjoy that. And now on to the next game. So the next game we have here is called World Reborn, and this one was originally picked up by Pico Interactive in 2015, and given this physical release that I've got here, it's impossible to find these days. I have a friend over on Twitter, a fellow game collector, who very, very kindly sold this to me for a really good price, and I'm so happy to add this to my collection. But I really want to get into the history of this game, so let me give you a little bit of a rundown, and then we'll talk a little bit about the game itself too. So World Reborn was being made by an indie game studio way back in around 2005 for the Game Boy Advance, and they'd actually almost finished the game. But unfortunately, they couldn't secure a publisher, there was some funding issues, and unfortunately they instead had to go and focus on a few licensed properties in order to keep the lights on in their studio. So they shelved this really interesting and unique game and went on to work on things like Hannah Montana and Barbie for the GBA and the DS. So it's an unfortunate consequence of the industry really. Thankfully though, Neopong a few years later actually decided to release the ROM for this game on their website so that everyone could enjoy what they'd put all of their hard work and effort into. And what's even more sad, not only did they finish the Game Boy Advance game and not get that published, but they were actually working on a sequel for the DS as well, which they also unfortunately didn't get round to releasing. But if it was anything like the GBA game, it would have been fantastic. So with that little bit of history out the way, let me tell you what the game's all about, because I was really surprised. So when I first played this game a few years ago for a previous video, I only really played the first 2 or so levels, and I thought that it was a really straightforward horizontal scrolling shooter with not that much going for it. But I've actually had a lot more time to sit down with the game, and I actually ended up completing it, so that goes to show how much I really enjoyed this. It's way more in depth than what I was originally expecting. Basically, you go through this kind of anime story, which is really nicely told through some really nice cutscenes and really fun dialogue. Then you get to pick a character, and they all have their own special abilities, their strengths and weaknesses and things like that. And then you also get to pick one of their ships to play in, and the ships all have different specials, they all control a little bit differently. But the most interesting thing about the game is the fact that as you're playing through these levels, you're actually building up your ship's stats, and anything that you've powered up actually retains into the future levels, and you can even go back and level grind in order to try and beat a few more difficult ones that maybe you got stuck at. There's also branching paths, so it is way more involved than I thought it was, and it's such a shame that this game never actually got a release, because it did seem like a really fun game, and I honestly think that if it had got a release back in 2005, that it would have actually done really well, and it could actually stand up against some of the other shoot-em-ups that are actually released officially on the system. It really is that good, so I definitely recommend going and trying to track down the ROM, because it was such a nice surprise that this game not only was cancelled and re-released, but it was also a really good game too. And the third game we're looking at here is called Broken Circle, and this was another game that's got a really sad story behind its development. This game began way back in 2004 when an artist called Elvis Morelli won a competition to get his game published. He teamed up with a programmer and they made the company Seven Ravens. The game progressed well and it was almost ready to be completed, but then right at the last minute the publisher backed out and unfortunately refused to release the game. At first they thought the reason was that the game was too big for them to publish based on their budget, so they took the game they'd already made, which came in at 256 megabytes, and tried to reduce that down to just 64. But even with all that hard work out of the way, the publisher still wasn't interested, and the game sat there unreleased for about 15 years after, until Pico picked it up and released the physical version that I'm holding right here. And I'm so glad it did finally get a release and the developers can see the fruits of their labour actually take physical form. But as for the game itself, it's kind of a strange isometric point of view RPG adventure game. The best thing about it is definitely the battle system. It's really interesting. Basically, you get a set of gems that you can use during the fight, and depending on what kind of attacks you use, they take up more slots. So in your turn, you can actually do up to 4 different things if you wanted. It gives you a lot more tactical options when you're in the battles, but unfortunately, outside of the battles, the game does fall a little bit flat. I feel like it could have done with a bit more development, and maybe the publisher was right to not release this one in the end, because a lot of the things that the characters say in the towns and in the cities just doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Obviously, English wasn't the developer's first language, and maybe if it was published, they might have done a bit of proofreading, but what is here in this final release is very, very either badly translated or written by people that don't quite understand English to its full extent. There was a lot of moments in this game where I was just scratching my head going, what were they even trying to convey in this scene? The graphics look really nice though, and there's loads of really nice animations, and like I said, the battle system is really good too, so with a bit more polish, this could have been a really good game in the GBA's library, but even so, it's just fantastic that this even exists at all, and thank you so much to Pico for actually giving it a full physical release. It's so interesting to play these games and find out about what could have been. I did actually discover a forum post back from 2009 in which the developer actually stated the reason why they decided not to move development over to the DS instead. Basically, it boils down to the fact that after working on the game for so long and putting in so much hard work, the fact that the game didn't see the light of day kind of made the developers a little bit depressed, and they decided not to progress with it any further than that. And they also moved on to working on other projects as well, so there was the possibility of a DS version, but again that got scrapped during the development. And that's it for these 3 games, but there is one more game that I found out about which might be getting a physical release in the next few years. And this one is called Odema and the Book of Magic. And this one looks to be kind of like a more kid-friendly version of a Metal Slug game. The graphics actually do look really cool, and I really hope that one day we'll actually be able to play this game. I spoke to Pico over on Discord, and they said they had actually purchased this game a while ago, but the developer that they were working with actually backed out of the project, and unfortunately they can't use any of his work in this version of the game that they'll be releasing, so unfortunately it means they will have to go back to square one, hire a new developer and try and get the game back on track. But they do own the rights to it, so it is looking promising, so maybe at some point in the next year or two, maybe we'll actually get a release of Odema and the Book of Magic. I'm really looking forward to it, so fingers crossed they can actually find a way to bring this game to life. And there's also tons of other cancelled and unreleased Game Boy Advance games out there. There was a fantastic episode made by Did You Know Gaming a few years ago that covers loads of them. There's so much out there, so any IP acquisition people out there watching this video, go ahead and check that one out and see whether you can track down any of the programmers. That's it for now though. If you do want to see more about cancelled GBA games, I actually did a video a few years ago about some ROMs that you can actually play online right now, so go ahead and click the video up here and watch that one next. And of course, if you did enjoy it, please consider joining me on Patreon and join everyone that's going across the bottom of the screen right now. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all very soon for the next episode. Goodbye.